Great. So there's another topic I would like to talk about tonight, and that's about the idea of self-inquiry or self-investigation. Now, this is a very useful tool when you're on a spiritual path or for just any kind of personal growth or evolution at all. I'm sure you've all heard that phrase of know thyself, how important it is to know thyself. And one reason it's important to know that is because it helps us understand ourselves. It helps us understand why we make the choices that we do in life. It helps us understand why we react the way we do to certain situations. And so it can be really useful to start examining yourself and your mind and watching and noticing how you react to certain situations or external circumstances. And one feeling that where this is very useful is the idea of feeling dissatisfied in life. So I think for me personally, I often feel a little bit dissatisfied in life. It often seems like things could be just a little bit better, right? It always seems like there's something that could make things better. I don't know if anyone else can relate to that. Um, this is actually a central concept in the teachings of Buddhism and other Eastern philosophies. This idea of it's the Sanskrit word often used is dukkha, and that's usually translated as suffering. So you've probably heard, if you've heard anything about Buddhism, you've heard that saying that existence is suffering, right? Well, suffering can sound a little bit extreme, and another translation of this word dukkha is just dissatisfaction. I think so that might be a little bit easier for some of us to relate to, because I think I know all of you pretty well, and I think most of us aren't really suffering in the sense of we're not struggling, we're not wondering where our next meal is coming from, we're not living in a refugee camp in Syria or anything like that. So I think sometimes people can be off-put by this idea of existence as suffering because it may not exactly feel like we're suffering all the time, but I think a lot of us can relate to feeling dissatisfied in life. And that's really the same idea that's central in these teachings. And so, like I said, I often feel dissatisfied. It often seems like there ought to be something out there that's going to make things better, right? Something that's going to make me happier, make me feel more complete. And so I've started to wonder, is there really anything out there that's going to make me feel fully satisfied all the time, right? And if you listen to Buddhism and also listen to modern psychology, the answer to that question is no, that we're often, we rarely ever feel completely satisfied in life. And there's a reason for that. And it's because some of the findings that are coming out of modern evolutionary psychology is that our brains are hardwired to be dissatisfied. There's a really interesting book that I've read a couple times now called Why Buddhism is True by Robert Wright. And in this book, he looks at the tenets and the teachings of Buddhism through the lens of evolutionary psychology. And that just means looking at these teachings in terms of how our brains developed over time and how our brains developed all these different programs and hardwired routines within them. And a lot of these findings from psychology are agreeing with the teachings in Buddhism that have been talked about for thousands of years. And so one of these central ideas of this book is that our brains are programmed by natural selection to never feel fully satisfied for very long. And that's because back when our brains were evolving, our ancestors were living in small hunter-gatherer tribes on the desert, just barely scraping by with enough food and resources to survive and reproduce. So it was a very different time than now. I mean, existence, just surviving was a struggle back then when our modern brains were evolving. And so back then, those ancestors of us, those cavemen and cavewomen, those cave people running around, the ones who were driven to gather the most resources and also have the most sex, Those are the ones who had the most offspring and then passed on their genes and that drive to gather stuff to the next generation. And so that's essentially how natural selection works. That those people, those ancestors, those early ancestors of us, those cave people who had the most offspring, passed on their genes the most to the next generation. And so in addition to this drive to gather lots of stuff, gather lots of resources, gather lots of food, and have lots of sex with mates, those are things that made our ancestors more successful and passed on more of their genes. But along with that was this tendency to not feel satisfied for very long once you acquired something. So let's think about it in terms of an example. So say you have caveman A over here. And this guy, this caveman A, he kills a deer and he has sex with his mate. And then he's satisfied for the next week. The whole next week, he's just basking in the glow of that tasty deer and that hot sex with his mate. And so he's just, chilling the whole rest of the week. So now imagine another caveman B over here. So same story. He kills a deer and has sex with his mate, but he's only satisfied for one day. So the next day, he's out there hunting for more food and chasing after more women. So I'm sure you can see how caveman B over time is going to have a lot more children, going to have a lot more offspring, and pass on his genes, these genes that make him feel not satisfied very long. So he's going to pass on that tendency to his offspring. And so over time, you can imagine that pretty soon all the cavemen are these horny, hungry fiends running around, killing all animals in sight, trying to screw every female they see. And so that kind of sounds like the world we live in now in some ways, doesn't it? So this is how, I mean, for me, this idea was really fascinating, that our brains are hardwired, are programmed to not feel satisfied when we get stuff. So and also we're programmed to want lots of stuff and then not feel satisfied when we get it. And so, yeah, to me, this was really kind of eye-opening. Like, it explains so much about myself. And so it really helps me understand myself and also kind of be a little less hard on myself, because we're dealing with these innate programs that are hardwired into our brains that make us feel dissatisfied all the time. And so I feel like, I hope you guys are as interested in this as me, because for me, this has kind of really helped me understand myself and be better to understand that when I'm feeling dissatisfied, that it's not really me. It's just a pattern that my brain is playing out, right? It's a program that my brain is stuck in and just goes through over and over again. And so seeing and understanding that it's just this pattern in my brain helps me and can help all of us have a little distance from that feeling, and generate some or cultivate some detachment from that feeling. So whenever you're feeling dissatisfied or feeling like you need something or craving something, it can help to realize that you don't actually want something or need something. It's just, this is a pattern that is programmed into your brain to play out over and over again.